Well, a divided country is prompting questions as to what's fueling that polarization, with many people pointing the fingers at the media. Although questions remain today as to whether it's fair to allocate the blame to those who push certain information as compared to those who are the recipients of said information. Here to help us break down the media landscape amid this crucial moment is Adam Guillette, the president of the media watchdog group Accuracy Media. Adam, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me back.
So it's a Monday, so there's a lot of the weekend type of shows. The Sunday morning shows in particular were heavily focused on the ongoing lawsuits brought forth by the Trump campaign. I want to show how George Stephanopoulos opened his show on ABC on Sunday and then get your insight on the other side. Let's take a look.
Good morning and welcome to This Week. We may not be surprised, but we should still be shocked. The election results have been clear for more than 2 weeks. Joe Biden defeated Donald Trump. And by recent standards, it wasn't all that close. More than 6 million votes nationwide. More than triple Donald Trump's 2016 margin in the key Midwestern battlegrounds. Plus wins in the longtime GOP strongholds Georgia and Arizona. 306 electoral votes.
So, Adam, I specifically used this clip since Stephanopoulos is a former communications director for President Bill Clinton, which we'll get to in a moment. But first, what's your take on the media's handling of this moment? I know they're going through a transition period. A lot's going on right now. How are they handling it?
Well, they're handling it as you would expect. They're cheerleaders for one side because they're directly part of that side. And Stephanopoulos is a great example of it. How can we pretend that he's a serious journalist? How does he get to moderate presidential debates when he's a former Clinton staffer? You're never going to see that happen with a former Trump staffer, that they get put on a major network, that they get to moderate a debate. And they're not alone. As we've talked about before, Now This, who has 15 million followers on Facebook, incredibly influential amongst young people, half of their executive board is former Stacey Abrams staffers, DNC staffers, Hillary Clinton staffers. The Democratic Party and their allies in the media oftentimes are one and the same.
And it's interesting, too, because, for example, even right now, when there are members of the Trump administration who are still in the White House, some networks won't even put them on television sometimes, let alone get a pundit to come on and give the other side of the argument. And the reason why I use Stephanopoulos as an example is to bring up the idea that there is a rotating door in media that seems to go one way, but it doesn't necessarily work for Republicans, or in this case, Trump supporters. In fact, Biden's reported Secretary of State nominee, Tony Blinken, used to be a CNN global affairs analyst before taking this job. So here he is criticizing President Trump's approach to the trade war with China.
You know, Fareed, he has a point on specific products and industries, but starting a trade war with our closest allies is not the way to make that point and to make it effectively. He's now started a race to the bottom. And far from retreating, our allies have threatened to retaliate. And if you are making pork or Harley Davidsons or orange juice or peanut butter in the United States, you're going to have a tariff slapped on your product by some of our closest partners. The Business Roundtable, some of the leading CEOs in our country, have said this is a profound mistake, that in terms of prices for consumers here in the U.S., our own ability to export, and economic growth, all endangered by a tariff war that the president started.
So, Adam, I guess my question is whether this type of rotating door practice is commonplace in the media, and do you expect to see a lot of former pundits in a potential Biden administration? And I guess adversely, do you expect to see members of the Trump administration eventually make their way into the media?
Well, you call it a rotating door. That suggests they're not in the same building. I really feel as if they're just the PR team for the Democratic Party these days. They go out there and they put out the exact same talking points that we hear from Democratic candidates, Democratic politicians. They're one and the same. We've joked before that rather than being regulated by the Federal Communications Commission, they should be regulated by the Federal Elections Commission. We saw it with Now This. We saw it with Stephanopoulos. We saw it with Steve Scully, who's going to moderate the presidential debate, having been a former Biden intern. But to your point with the Trump campaign, not only are we not going to see those folks get hired by CBS News, but they're already putting them on an enemies list to have them removed from polite society, essentially. The hypocrisy is outrageous, and it must be exposed.
And we've covered stories on this program before, for example, that there's a group of students at Harvard that say that they don't want former Trump administration officials to even be teachers there. They literally don't even want to hear the other side of the argument that is supported, by the way, by 50% of the country. And I don't think it's only a detriment to conservatives, but also to liberals. If you're not getting the other side of the argument, how can you combat the ideas? How can you know what the other side is putting out there? It's a total disservice to those who are politically minded, not to mention the average American voter who wants to hear both sides. But we know by now that there is a double standard to a large degree when it comes to our news coverage. It's something that we've largely come to accept at this point, I think. I think everybody knows when you go to a certain network, you're getting a certain opinion. But the latest example comes to these Dominion voting systems, where questioning the integrity of those machines is now heavily criticized, but that wasn't always the case. So here's MSNBC asking the very same questions back in 2019.
This is a very paranoid scene here, Ali. We're among some of the greatest hacking minds in the country, people who've been brought together by, above-board companies to try to be as creative as they can and as insidious as they can in attacking systems like you see behind me. These are some of the most common systems used as of 2018 in elections, and so they're here to really test this stuff out. Companies like ES&S and Dominion, which are the top manufacturers of voting equipment, they had to buy this stuff on eBay and through government surpluses. That's what the organizers told me here. And so the idea that we have to sort of pull this stuff in order to test it out without the cooperation of the companies involved is really quite alarming.
So at one point, it was okay to ask questions about something as sacred as our election system, and I think that's a good thing. But when we're talking about something as sacred as our elections, how important is it to be critical when necessary, but also accurate and trustworthy, and yes, sometimes ask questions?
Well, the media, in terms of being trustworthy, is a laughable notion. They've lost, if you look at the recent Pew Research surveys, studies, they've lost tremendous trust from the American people. And what we're seeing with the potential voter fraud is perhaps the best example of it. They should be doing investigative journalism. I don't know if there was widespread fraud or not, but shouldn't these quote-unquote journalists be looking into it instead of coordinating their ally as the president immediately? It's frustrating that during the campaign trail, accuracy in media, we had to lead the way with investigative journalism into candidates in Iowa and in other states. Why can't the media do the job that they give themselves Pulitzer Prizes for? Why can't they go out and do investigative journalism into potential voter fraud associated with these machines? They acknowledged a year ago, as your clip showed, that this is a potential problem. Well, show us now whether or not it actually happened.
And, it was the same thing during the Hunter Biden email saga. I know that the New York Times and the Washington Post, they have some of the greatest resources, some of the greatest investigators in the entire world. I know they could have figured out if it was verified, if it wasn't, get behind those allegations, the same way they could with these voting systems as well. But I think that the fact that they won't even look into it tells you all you really need to know. And MSNBC's Chuck Todd voiced his concerns about the fact that, as you mentioned, some people are moving away from mainstream networks and are instead looking for other sources of information, whether it be on social media platforms such as Facebook and Twitter. So let's take a look at him laying out his frustrations right here.
We now have a chunk of the electorate that has said, no, don't tell me your facts. I don't like your facts. And even when they hear the facts from a on-again, off-again news organization that does actually publish a fact, they run away from it. I'm sorry. I'm yet to have anybody prove to me that Facebook can be a trustworthy platform for information right now.
So I think there's two sides to that. One is addressing the fact that people are moving onto social media platforms looking for more independent type of networks, but that doesn't necessarily address the idea as to why. So what does that tell you? Are many networks becoming concerned that they're losing their grip on the American audience and are slowly but surely giving ground to emerging platforms?
Well, what you're saying, he's exactly recognizing a real legitimate problem. The American people are turning away from traditional media. But what he doesn't realize is the cause of it. The cause of it isn't that the American people suddenly became less intelligent and would rather get their news from Facebook, but instead they were betrayed by these journalists for decades and they caught on to it. So as soon as alternative news sources appeared, they were happy to ditch the existing news sources and gobble them up. As soon as instead of reading your local paper to get today's news, you could find an online source or listen to talk radio, quickly those folks suffered. And it's because they betrayed the American people with their bias. And now many of these outlets have realized the problem. They have realized they've lost viewership, clicks, subscribership, but their solution is even worse. Rather than going back and putting out honest journalism, they're just trying to preach to the choir in a desperate attempt to appease an anti-Trump left-wing audience and hold on to that group however they can.
And it's interesting, too, that they're using the same tactics that people use against them. They cry disinformation, say that it's not accurate or anything like that. But I think the whole reason why people are leaving some of these networks is because of the very same allegations made against them, saying, I can't trust this information. It's clear that you're trying to prove a narrative more so than putting facts out. And I think a lot of people are starting to see through that and are starting to seek out the information themselves, which is a double-edged sword to a big degree. But Adam Guillette, it's always a pleasure having you on this program, breaking down our media headlines. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me.